Good afternoon. It's my real pleasure to welcome all of you to the 5th annual keynote address sponsored by the Oncofertility Consortium. This is a great event and something that we look forward to annually. And if I reflect back over the keynote speakers that we've had, we started with a patient advocate, moved to a clinician, to a basic scientist, to social scientist, and now this year we have with us Lori Zoloth, who is a philosopher, ethicist, and a ponderer and a reflector. And she, as you know, has been with us actually before the consortium began and has been a great leader within our program. She is the director of the Center for Bioethics and a professor of religion and Jewish studies at Northwestern University's Weinberg School of Science, where she is also the director of the Brady Program in Ethics and Civil Life, which brings outstanding scholars to our university every year, including those interested in oncofertility and religion. In 2001, she was the president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and received their Distinguished Service Award in 2007. She also served for 2 terms as the NASA National Advisory Council, and which is the highest civilian advisory board for NASA, and also received their service award. She is the chair of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Bioethics Advisory Board. Here at Northwestern, she's been nothing short of transformative. She founded the Oncofertility Humanities Boot Camp and co-edited the 2nd book on oncofertility, which describes contemporary thinking on oncofertility, religion, and the law. She's also formed a think tank with the religious leaders of the metropolitan Chicago, which led to a full-day meeting of Catholic social workers, thinkers, and ethicists earlier this year. She has not sat on the sidelines, but actively translated her group's work into clinical practice, specifically advocating for the research on the provision of non-biological adoption for young cancer patients, as well as on information for clergy so they can help advise their parishioner. I know you shouldn't say that your bioethicist is your friend, but I consider Lori Zoloth a great scholar, teacher, thinker, and friend. And I'm really pleased that on this, our 5th anniversary, that you are coming to the podium to present your keynote address. As with NASA and the other service that she's given, she's received an award, and I'm very happy tonight to give you a little token of our appreciation, Lori, on the event of your keynote. It is our tradition as a consortium to give to our keynote speakers our book that we've published. Well, you are the author of the book, so I thought we couldn't really do that, so we came up with this little paperweight, and I hope it will remind you of the weight that you've had on all of us as you've held us to our principles and to our ideals, and we're so happy to have you address us today. The address that she's selected to deliver, I just spoke with her. She said it's a traditional philosopher's address, so we should be ready to take notes. And it is titled, "The Duty of Repair in a Broken World, Ethical Questions After 5 Years of Oncofertility Research." Lori, it's a pleasure to have you at the podium.
Thank you. Well, in philosophy, we call this a frontal assault paper. And I'm going to be reading texts and reading stories, and you don't have to take notes, but this is the way we do it. And I wanted to do it this way in my last chance. People who are my philosophy grad students just laughing in the corner, because normally we go native. We do PowerPoint for you, right? Sort of pretending that we're like science guys. And we sit there like with you've got the graphs, and we put little words up like, oh, please. So this is the kind of paper that you would get at a philosophy conference, and so here you go. All right. I'll put a few texts up. I read fast, so the actual text you'll see before you. Oh, there's even like some strange science-y thing that I have no idea what that is, but guys in the back? No? No. Okay, words back to me. Okay. You shall not watch your brother's ox or sheep go astray and hide yourself from them. You shall, in any case, bring them again to your brother. And if your brother is not near you, or if you know him not, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall be with you until your brother seeks after it, and you shall restore it back to him. In like manner shall you do with his donkey, shall you do with his garment, and with every lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found, shall you do likewise. You may not hide yourself. You shall not watch your brother's donkey or his ox fall down by the way and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him to lift them up again. The world we find ourselves in, the world we are given to live in, is a broken place. We lose things, for one, even our coat, even our animals, without which we cannot live. In the textual world, the scripture that I study as a Jewish moral philosopher, it is a matter of such serious concern that it is considered with great care in the passage above, how to respond to the ordinary, tragic losses we see all around us. The losses in the scriptural passages are the sort of thing that can happen in an instant and engulf your brother, your sister in great grief. First, it's likely that a person only has one ox or one garment, and the getting of a new one may be economically impossible. Read it, the text, as if it says, you shall not watch your brother's car go astray and hide yourself from it. Read it as if it says, in like manner shall you do with his computer and with his one winter coat in Chicago, and then you feel the impact. Second, catching and returning an entire ox is not a trivial matter, nor is it to care for it until the owner is found. And finally, pretending it's not your problem, that you're not an oxen catcher, or you don't even know the guy, the loser in question, it's not an option. He remains the loser as your brother until the act of restoration is accomplished. In the text, it is his need for the recovery of the object that names him as your brother. You are responsible for his restoration no matter what it takes, no matter how long it takes. It is a remarkable claim in our time of economic collapse when we're so quick to turn from the plight of the other, the loser. Throughout the Hebrew scripture and the text of the New Testament and the Quran, we find this particular problem of loss discussed, that we have to be concerned about the particulars of the tragic losses of others when we know them, when we don't, when we're guilty of their wounds, and when we have nothing to do with causing their pain. We are still participants, witnesses to the event of their loss. For Christian theologian Stanley Hauerwas, witness and solidarity may be all one can do. The garment's lost, you must guard it in the hope that your brother will return. And the garment is never really lost as long as the hope is never really lost. You, the reader, are the force that keeps loss from deepening into finality. But you, participants in the Oncofertility project, are largely doctors and researchers. And it's perhaps the case that a more complex moral gesture than witness can be required of you. In this sense, what is being asked by the call of the text that you must not hide? Why does watching imply doing, standing forth, becoming responsible in the utterly endless way I'm arguing you must? Of course, the repetition of the command not to hide recalls the first of all demands in Scripture to be responsible, capable of saying, here I am. It recalls that in Genesis, when Adam and Eve try to hide from their inquisitive yearning to know the world through their own touch and taste, the first gesture of scientific pragmatism, they have sinned. Now, we're going to return to that puzzling story in a bit. But however, this small passage is one of the internal justifications for medical intervention in all of Jewish thought. If, goes the argument made most recently by Elliot Dorff, you must return a lost object or an oxen to a person, surely you must also restore lost health to him as well. So this brings me, by a very circular route, a route that perhaps suggests a return, to the nature, goal, and meaning of the project that came to be called Oncofertility over 5 years ago. The project whose conception and birth and 5th birthday we celebrate tonight. Now, Oncofertility largely exists because of one person, the gifted Teresa Woodruff, of course. But like all children brought into being, it takes a village. And as the talented Sarah Rodriguez, medical historian, can remind us, in every science project, there are dozens of quiet voices and unseen steady hands that make the work possible. So my first act tonight is not only to acknowledge Teresa, of course, for her astonishing, tireless, and breathtaking work, but also to acknowledge every research subject who courageously volunteered, every staffer who makes it all possible, every lab tech, postdoc, doctoral student, nurse, and social worker, everyone who makes the good work of the PIs of each complex project go forward. I was one such PI, working on the ethics project. And that work was supported by a terrific group of undergraduate researchers, 3 graduate students, Elisa Henning, Michelle Racher, and Marissa Gustanian, all of whom are now moving towards careers in bioethics. 2 postdocs, Sarah Rodriguez and Lisa Campo-Edelstein, who have now taken scholarly leadership in this field and made it their own, and a great staff, Brian, Jamie, and Caroline. Finally, Linda Emanuel, as PI of the entire R01D, allowed us to point out ethical issues, all the lost and wandering objects that need to be returned, and supported my research with her entire staff, including research on the questions that religious ethics brings to the discourse. Now, it's long been the contention of the field of bioethics that we stand as outsiders to the moral work of medicine, raising the questions of the stranger to the practitioners of the research. And if this is the case, and I believe it is, then religious ethics raises the ever more strange questions, impertinent questions of meaning and human purpose, difficult and dangerous questions of why, and difficult and risky discussions that recall things that all patients know, the stakes of the questions, the persons who will bear the real cost of research and treatment, and the tragic loss at the heart of medicine. The Academy, from the Greeks of the 5th century BCE through the 1600s and Bacon, and then Kant and the entire 18th century, assumed that these religious questions, questions about wholeness and casuistry, had a central place in human knowledge. However, since the rise of the German and post-Civil War American university system, the hallmark of the university and the med school is skepticism. The method of knowledge is to understand increasingly smaller parts of the whole and ask questions about how and what, not why, about the natural world. I want to focus on these earlier dangerous questions, both in a descriptive and normative way. First, I want to describe to you briefly some of the ethical issues that have emerged in the last 5 years, and I want to extrapolate some other issues that are yet to be fully considered. And finally, I want to offer some norms that I suggest are needed if the research is to proceed ethically. We began when we first reflected on the project later named Oncofertility, as it was before the project was funded or even started. And at stake was the problem of asking patients to participate in very tenuous, very speculative research. So we called this research the Joseph Project, named for the concept of storing seed against a dreams theory of scarcity and justice. At stake was the moral question: can a society use its resources to create a project that may never turn out to be needed, or may fail, purely on the basis of speculation, a dream? It is the question of nearly all of basic modern research, but it was made imperative by the urgency of cancer, which will steal the chance of fertility unless swift interventions are made. And these chances come only once. Our principle was to bet on the dream and make plans and policy in advance of possibility. So Woodruff and her team collected data from patients long before results occurred even in the murine model. And we used this text of the Joseph narrative to inquire, noting that Joseph's stories are a core part of Christianity, Judaism, and Islamic texts. Our question about speculative research followed along these lines. And here you can see the text about 7 hears of grain and full and good and putting aside grain. And then the text next turns to who should oversee the plan and let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise person and put them in charge of the land of Egypt. So Teresa seemed to fit the job description. We argued the research could proceed. We based this on 2 ethical principles: equity, meaning that if preservation of gametes was possible for boys and men, it was ethically permissible for girls and women. And second, that the person should determine the burdens and benefits should be the families who had faced the actual issues in the past. And thus, a study was done that asked girls and mothers who had survived cancer in adolescence about their reasons and reactions. It was strongly supportive of the ideas, creating some empirical data for proceeding. In the next several years, however, our consideration of these issues deepened. We next explored 2 other issues. First was the issue of truth-telling. Now, researchers like yourselves face a complicated dilemma. As the research was first initiated, each patient was not only told about the procedure and about the experimental nature of basic science, but that they would be kept fully informed about the tissue samples. In the process of the research, you know, 80% of their tissue is frozen directly after surgery to be available for use should research experiments prove successful. And the other 20% is donated for your research. But then there's a question of what to tell patients about the fate of the 20% of tissue that they donated to research as it begins to yield results, or not yield results. Now, early in the grant, the protocol was rewritten, and now, like many protocols, all tissue was de-identified, and researchers were not specific about the fate or condition of one person's tissue. However, the first set of patients were told they would be kept abreast of their tissue status in a personal and direct way. Now, the procedures are never anonymous. They're done by a known physician. The tissue is well labeled, and each case is personal and contextual. And thus, a great deal of information is known. Now, in some cases, the tissue looked good, and the researchers are excited by this. In other cases, they considered the tissue, in the language of the lab, crappy, meaning it was of poor visual quality, which is the language, as you know, of all IVF and stem cell researchers. But what should they tell the patient who's paying for tissue storage for about the other 80% and will perhaps for decades, should she know her tissue is crappy? And at stake was whether the language and promise could be changed for new patients, and if so, what was the duty to the first patients? And we were divided on how to proceed. Were they have to explain they were undoing a promise made to them? How much truth to tell? And there was a conflict between wanting to support full disclosure and the participatory model and withholding and protecting patients. Patients want to know what's going on with this intimate part of their body upon which their entire future is engaged. In fact, the team will need to keep contact with them for a long time to come, and the question would be raised inevitably about whether it's realistic to hope for a genetic family. More issues will emerge, such as the problem of finding out that there's genetic diseases that might affect fertility or may cause her not to be able to reproduce with her own eggs, and such as the oncogenes themselves. And as more research uncovered more knowledge, the knowledge becomes more important. But more knowledge may change the standards, too. What if in 5 years hence or 10 years hence, a new breakthrough is made and the bad tissue is no longer bad because it could be stimulated in a different manner? And as we saw as these years proceeded, we did change techniques all over the place. Now, once you begin to speculate about the future, either good or bad, then you're engaging speculation of the most ephemeral sort, risking hyping or fear-mongering to our patients. The fact that knowledge bases are mutable in all fronts means that any information is potentially misleading. So what is true? Now, moral appeals were made from many directions in this first case, and we debated it fiercely. It was argued that patients cannot be allowed to think they have a therapeutic advantage from a clinical trial. Yet in this case, the entire premise is based on the sense of hope and promise. And is it a clinical trial anymore, or what? So it would only be, our problem was, to some extent, the tissue, once separated from the patient as research material, is now in a separate category. It's more like any other tissue used in basic research, like HeLa cells. Promises should be kept, we insisted, and telling the entire truth is important. This is their tissue. They're intimately connected to it. And why hide relevant information as you learn it? Now, we reminded them, the researchers, that minimizing harm and having compassion to the actual persons facing an actual human tragedy is a core value of medicine. And we had to avoid paternalism by understanding we cannot protect patients from being upset, and thus we'd never hide difficult news. But should this be a part of our considerations? The problem was that patients and research subjects and tissue donors are all promised different things, and their relationship to the researcher varies. Their tissues ideally should not be confused, but in this protocol, they were all three things at different times in the course of the experiment. Is Northwestern University promising to act as the broker for families after fertility? Or is it using a tissue for a basic research trial? There's confusion. Are the doctors still the doctors of patients in clinical trials, especially if they'll be the human subjects to bear children from these protocols? Should it work out in the future? In this case, the research was always deeply and inevitably intertwined with the lives of the women. Now, there were options: a maximal transparent disclosure of all details of the procedure and outcome and research findings as the project proceeded, including the complete sense of uncertainty, or a combination of some truthful elements and some withheld elements, or a full disclosure or full anonymity. So we turned to a text. We call this Humanities to the Rescue. We were faced with uncertain knowledge and with deep uncertainty on every front. When seriously considered, it all threatened to destabilize the work. How did we know what was real? And here is where I turned to literature, and in this case, religious rabbinic literature, to create a frame for our response. And this is a Mishnah, a text written in about 6th century AD. The officer said, between the 2nd century and 6th century, the officer said to them, "Go forth and see whether the time for morning sacrifice has arrived. If it has arrived, then he who saw it says, 'It is daylight.'" Matthias ben Samuel said, "The whole east is alight. It is daylight. Even unto Hebron?" And he answered, "Yes." But who was it that said yes? The man standing on the roof. Is he the dreamer and the interpreter? Should it be he then who is standing on the ground? And how does he know? If you like, say it is he who stands on the roof, continues the commentary on the text. And if you like, say it is he who stands on the ground. If you want to say it is he who stands on the roof and says, the whole east is a light, the one standing on the ground answers, even unto Hebron, whereupon the former says, yes. If you like, say it is he who stands on the ground who says, the whole east is a light, whereupon the other responds, even unto Hebron, and the former answers, yes. Okay, so what's going on in this text? Who are these people? The socio-religious question considered is the case of having to make normative decisions based on realities of the natural world when the sun comes up, in the face of the uncertainty of stance and method, and in the face of competing truth claims. Sound familiar? At stake is, when is it time for the first prayers and sacrifice in the morning? But there's a disagreement. Someone is standing on the roof and someone standing on the ground. It's hard to tell who is who, hard to deny anybody their claim, and we readers, who are watching, of course, but the natural world is a difficult thing. Yes, there'll be clarity in the future when everybody's awake and off to work, and then it really will be morning. But now, has the morning star appeared? As in medical research, in the Talmud, there's been false sightings. The moon once gave the appearance of the sun. There was a mistake. There was false hope. And the apparatus of healing and salvation, the whole temple service itself was ramped up, and it was a mistake. You must be careful. Thus, the two locations, one on the roof and one on the ground. But who said yes, they ask? Maybe it's the guy on the roof, but maybe not. Perhaps the guy on the ground. One is called the dreamer, and one is called the interpreter, and one decidedly not. But note that the answer is not given in the text, only the instructions for how to conduct an argument. Whatever is said is countered, and that's the point. You need both locations to determine the reality. As in the text, the positions are changeable, uncertain who is who. Is the dreamer and interpreter the one that confirms that it's morning? Or is the one on the ground the person that confirms that it's morning? And who are we, ethicists, watching all of this? I'm entirely uncertain of this point. Who's seeing the future better, more accurately, the scientist or the humanist? The text, though, suggests a role for me based on discord and counter-narratives and discourse, and that's what we found compelling about this project, the possibility of raising what we called a discordant narrative. So we did offer a recommendation in our usual disagreeing about it way. I argued that infertility had to be devoted to full truth-telling, thus moving toward another ethical principle in the project. If you're counting, that's 3. It fostered autonomy with the fullest respect for persons. It's consistent with the complex and multiple roles of the subject. The tissue is, by definition, not anonymous. It's part of a long trial. And the subjects need to be fully informed at all times. Adults, I said, need to be able to decide what to do with their own body with a full range of medical and scientific information, including honest information about your scientific uncertainty. But this was not the only new problem. Dorothy Roberts and the others from the legal section of the project began to raise a question about how to justify insurance coverage. And here we thought the issue was fairly clear for cancer patients, based on duties that emerged from the normative practices of medical ethics. If you harm a patient as a side effect of treatment, every effort should be made to repair these iatrogenic injuries. If this is true for patients who are burned in radiation therapy, then we argued it was true for patients who become infertile via that or other cancer treatments. We called this the principle of equal justice. This decision, I would argue, returns us to the text I began with about the lost objects. You witnessed a loss. You cannot hide. You must do what you can to restore the lost object, or in this case, a lost capacity to the person in need. But what are the limits of those needs, we then asked? If what is needed is not a simple act, give the ox back, but one that is both highly technical and taken in violation of established rules and norms, how does the work proceed? Oncofertility is like that. It deconstructs fundamental human narratives in the service of restoring bodily integrity. And once scientists remove gametes from the bodies of persons and take them and put them to use in a lab for which money is exchanged and from which potentially new people can be created, then a complex moral act with many new moral actors makes a new narrative of reproduction. But what are the limits then on science, creativity, and technique? Here's another ethical problem of considerable gravity, and here's another text, one that deals with the use of fire, the first, basically, of all technologies. Where it is the practice to light a lamp at home on the night of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, One must light one, but where's the practice not to light? One must not. And we light lamps in synagogues and schoolhouses and dark alleys and for the sake of invalids. Now the question arises, faced with a day, Yom Kippur, the holiest days of atonement for Jews, in which lighting a fire or kindling an oil lamp is prohibited, can one light one in the evening before the day officially begins at sundown and just keep it on through the holiday of Yom Kippur? The opinion seems to be that in a private home, it's simply a matter of personal habit, but in the case of social communities, one ought to ensure that the light is on in synagogues, schools, dark alleys, and where one cares for the ill or injured. Now this seems straightforward, but the rabbis who wrote the text have more to say, or perhaps wish to extend this idea to make a larger moral point. Is it about light and darkness, about private and public obligation, about the duties to the ill? Well, it's about all of these. In a long and complicated response, the act of fire making, which is traced back to the first fire created by Adam at the end of the first Sabbath, back to our Genesis story, it's a sort of creative act, but it could be dangerous, but it could save lives. We then use the boundaries suggested by this and other texts to struggle with the new creative actions that you scientists were taking. They were permissible and dangerous, thus only to be used with care in limited situations with rules that protected society as a whole that might be different from personal ones. Now, we considered other ethical issues at great length. I'm not going to go into all of them here. How are pediatric cases different than adult cases? What are the issue of lesbian couples? What about the special case of the dying patient? In this work, we finally struggled with the role of outsiders for one of the ethical challenges we found that we, too, came to believe, as Howard Shapiro, former president of Princeton and former chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Committee under President Clinton, said, science is a magnificent achievement to the human mind, and the manner in which scientists order the facts of the natural world is often full of subtlety and beauty. As a cultural activity, science can be a source of great hope for humankind. But it is not enough, however, to be in awe of science. It's critical to understand both its promises and its limitations. We came to trust and to care for the scientists we watched. And as we did, challenging them became far more difficult and thus far more important. For if I cannot raise the deepest and most fundamental challenges in the same fearless way that a great researcher goes after the hardest questions, what good am I? Americans yearn, I believe, to live decent lives. And we have come to see scientists as the powerful champions of the yearning, but yet most of us outsiders are realistic about the pressures of the market on science, the increasing danger that the economic crisis would destabilize their funding, the pressures to produce research that can be sustained. What does that mean exactly when religious texts are brought into contemporary dilemmas in the most experimental science projects like this one on oncofertility? We have a genuinely new capacity in the world. You've done that. We can study and create human eggs from ovarian tissue. It is a thing that has never been done before. Is it permissible? What sort of knowledge is it? Whose lives will be altered? Who will gain? Who will lose? When we insist on ethical questions, especially ones that emerge from religious texts and traditions that insist on duties to the larger society, we turn in different directions from the products that grants seek to create, and that's just true. After 5 years of oncofertility, newborn as a new thing in the world, we are asked to evaluate the success of the conception of oncofertility. Have we collectively advanced human understanding of the processes of the natural world? To be sure. Is the project self-sustaining? Is the technology under the marketplace system that pays for health care via insurance credible to the funders? We hope we have made the moral case that it ought to be. But the question I am most deeply interested in is harder to make a deliverable. Does it create a better moral life? I've shown a bit of how the basic research of Jewish decision-making exists within a complicated, sophisticated intellectual tradition, in which the rabbinic sources clearly demonstrate a facility with knowledge from a variety of sources, and in which the question, how do we know, is answered by a variety of replies, sometimes analytic and sometimes anthropological, based in a study of customs, sometimes linguistic, based in narratives. The traditional sources from which the legalistic decisions are drawn do not just provide us with straightforward answers to complex decisions, but instead they model a form of analysis which considers community values, philosophy, story, and logic. The discourse of ethics and philosophy intertwines with legalistic analysis. And in this overlap, this intellectual space, then bioethics lives. Ethics is the first philosophy, notes Emmanuel Levinas, meaning it was the quotidian, daily relationships between people that must precede any abstraction about being. Thus, our work in oncofertility is animated by several relationships that overlay this scholarly work, and that raises the bar. In terms of what sorts of questions we raise about science, it raises the bar. Here, I wonder if we can say that the questions in this project might be similar, even familiar to others we've raised in bioethics before, but the effort to raise them in the kind of collaborative manner that we attempted across disciplines, that is different. Christian Kierkegaard, an analytic philosopher, notes the relationship between agency, action, and self-constitution, the making of the self. Her framework sheds light on a way to understand this relationship between self and history and story and act. That is what I mean when I talk about ethics and rationality and law. I mean the intricacies of practical reasoning, praxis that shape the ethical responses. We are, says Kierkegaard, as did Aristotle and Kant, and I would add Jewish philosophers from Maimonides through Levinas, possessed of a plight in that we are creatures who cannot not act. We are creatures who cannot not act. This reality, called necessitation, is particularly in evidence when we are confronted with suffering. We make choices to do actions. Actions are the object of our choices, and the acts are choices largely for their ends. That we can deliberate about. But the act and the end are only part of the action, which also includes our reasons for acting then, law that motivates and may be understood as divinely important, good or inevitable. In this sense, action is also chosen for its own sake, for nobility in the Hellenistic sense, the Greek sense, or for imperative in the Kantian sense, or for Torah in the Jewish sense, or for Christ in the Christian sense. It is this which renders our lives worthy of value, and it makes the activities, the science, in this sense holy, meaning having the quality of that elusive partnership that is the basis of tikkun olam, or repair of the world. Our actions then are not only self-determinative, they are world-determinative. What sort of world we will create is the question lying behind all of the emerging science. It must be the core ethical question for oncofertility as well. So what are the unresolved questions? Well, bioethics rests on the perfect principles of a liberal theory of the good. We are told to do good, which we rationally judge as the beneficent act based on the tradition of normative Western values, to avoid harm, which we take to mean avoiding error, accident, and the inevitable loss of human interactions, and to support autonomy, which in modernity comes to look at the capacity for endless choice despite physical or social limits. There are underlying problems with this, as many have pointed out. I argue that the example of advanced reproductive technology is fraught with such problems. I have said that I believe there is a duty to repair that which you have broken or witnessed to be broken, in the sense that our scriptural passage argues. And I have said that restoration, if possible, of bodily integrity or chance, as opposed, by the way, to bodily wholeness or completeness, might, under certain circumstances, involve the research and treatment of infertility secondary to cancer and its treatment. But let me raise some questions about the limits of this claim. And these questions, again, are largely drawn from the work of Harold Shapiro. First, we have to question whether a powerful treatment for infertility is good to develop, and then to use in an expanding circle of cases without regulation or limits. We've seen, for example, the use of sperm and IVF clinics to allow for the creation of groups of siblings of 150 members, a profound and nearly unique phenomena in our species which should trouble us. But what should be the limits on the number of oocytes brought to fruition or fertilized from one individual? And who should decide? What are the limits on the exchange brought into being by the language of autonomy? Second, what is the meaning of the language that surrounds infertility and the longing for, quote, a child of one's own? What is meant when we do that? Harowitz notes that having children is one important way to signal our understanding that the future will not be ours to create, that it belongs to these children we love and raise, not to us. But this idea surely extends to the care of all children beyond the borders of the ones we call ours. How does the deep and sustained attention to advanced reproductive technologies support the enlargement of our moral duty and the recognition that children we love do not have to be children whose genes match ours? Third, what moral limits, if any, should there be on human activity? Are there impermissible human activities? What moral limits and what regulations and responses are needed when the bodies of others are suggested for the repair of harm, as in the use of surrogates? What moral limits can be set on the extraordinary problem of the marketplace in so rare and so valuable an entity as a gamete? And how can the temptation of the marketplace be resisted? Fourth, is this a new technology that so expands the range of things we do in medicine that it becomes a thing of which we ought to seek a just distribution? When does this intervention become a necessity, and who should decide? Fifth, should techniques and interventions learned in an NIH grant about cancer survivors be used to address infertility with causes essentially social in nature, such as cultural practices? Sixth, in a world so burdened with primary infant and maternal mortality, orphaned and starving children, and 1 in 5 children in the US suffering from hunger, would it ever be justified to question the research imperative or the duty for the integrity that I've just argued for, and when? 7, given the research of the last keynote speaker in basic biology who preceded me, who raised the problem of obesity and cardiac complications in his mice that have been created in IVF, what are the safety limits on human capacities to do research with very long-lasting effects? And how are the unknown risks borne, and by whom? And finally, 8, since science is a social activity, and since it cannot serve everyone's interest at the same time, it's inevitably influenced by ideologies and conflicts of interest. How are these conflicts uncovered and challenged? Considering these questions seriously will call for more than a list of regulatory practices and a way to enforce them, though it will surely need those too. This will call for other principles, or theopolitical norms, the economy of other deliverables, ones that are very intangible. For all of science is in a debt relationship to the other, surely the researchers in the field of oncofertility are deeply in debt to the patients and families who've offered their bodies, their gametes, and their hopefulness. So what would really responsible conduct in research look like? We have a duty to heal the ill and to save lives if we can and care for them if we cannot. It is this duty that animates advocacy of medical research. For Jewish law, it is an overriding a priori duty, taking precedence over other ritual or practice obligations like the Sabbath. This obligation is not only a Jewish premise, it is one of the intrinsic goals of medicine. And as I noted above, one of the goals of all medical research too. Now in other work, I've said I've extended this duty, and I'd argue that it should be an ethically goal of a minimal, decent civil society. It's regrettable that this duty tends to be isolated instead of given off to others, to physicians and the dwindling supply of nurses. But the taking on of this obligation to one's neighbor broadens our understanding of both who the neighbor is supposed to be to us and who we are supposed to be to the neighbor. In the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, I am transformed by my duty to answer the call of the neighbor because I am the one who must come up with the goods. Each must participate in this duty to restore. One can never hide. For Levinas, we must answer the call to help and heal with our entire social goods, with our bodies if we need be, with the skin of ourselves, he says. My life is defined by my service to the vulnerable. What might really occur in the debate about ethics if we took this philosophical claim to heart? It might help us to understand that altruism is a good and possible human endeavor, and to see the moral value of gifts instead of fearing coercion or worrying about ownership and property at every step of our process. The moral universe is so constituted to be broken, unstable, violent, and failed. But without this step towards the other, it is possible we are made whole only by the gesture as well. In fact, it is this radical recognition of your utter responsibility that allows us to break out of the paralyzing and deadening an idea that the pain of the other and the loss of the other is just not my problem, that it can be ignored or hidden from, or that the stranger really is not your brother, your sister. The duty of repair comes from the facticity of the broken world. Understanding that one cannot fix with science the aching loss at the core of human life, our contingency, our fragility allows humility to enter the practice of science. But understanding that you must pull the arc of the universe towards justice yourself allows science to find its humanity by attention to the right sort of question. Over the last several years, we do have some settled questions. The research is justified, we believe, by appeals to gender equity, veracity, equal justice after harms, and the claim that patient assessment of their situation of risk bears critical weight, a sort of limited post hoc use of autonomy as assessment. We agreed that technology has to be judged in context, and that the use of some technologies are morally permissible for the ill and vulnerable, that are not morally permissible for others. So far, we agreed on that. You shall not watch your brother's donkey or his ox fall by the way, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him to lift them up again. The text in the section of Deuteronomy is in many ways a repairing of events and stories in Genesis. If Adam and Eve sinned, perhaps it is not in trying to acquire knowledge of the physical world or in seeking to fill up a new hunger. It was in hiding when things had gone wrong. We, not being in Eden, just know this feeling, the great loss of cancer, the brokenness it engenders, even in the face of the new prospects for containment that you've brought to us, draws the researchers to the duty of repair. And in this repair, I want to end by asking you for 3 commitments: to fidelity, hospitality, and justice. Fidelity meaning you will do what you say you will do and never promise more than your solidarity. In a world so uncertain and in research conducted in the midst of tragedies so fraught, we have little really to offer to patients, not yet, not fully. Research is only the gaze, the observation, trying to see in the dark before morning comes. What we have, we argued, is fidelity. Now, this principle works on all levels. I promise to tell you the truth, to tell you everything I know and fear. In the text, the person on the roof needs the one on the ground. One cannot exist as the sole narrator of the story. But I would call on you to go beyond that. Would you promise to stand with the research subjects, whatever the outcome, for however long it will take? Will you tell them the truth about the limits of repair? Hospitality means that what you have, who you are, must be shared, for the poor are entitled to the corners of your holdings. The Oncofertility Project is a national model in this, I believe, because of the OSA projects for the poor. This opening up of the lab to the children of the poorest in Chicago is a remarkable moment and one of the strongest aspects of the work replicated now all over. It is part of the work, it is not tangential to it. Scientists, ethicists, and citizens live together in a moral community, tied in 1,000 ways by our past and by a shared vision of the kind of society we would like to become, by accountability, and by the nature of the obligations we have to the interests of others, says Shapiro. Finally, I ask you to commit to a principle of justice. Continue to do so. I call on you as you go forward to remember the centrality of the poor, of the vulnerable. For if the research only provides a social good, a new one to the privileged, it cannot be called ethical. I am so very pleased to have been asked to raise difficult questions and to do what Socrates said that all philosophers ought to do, to sting you, to worry you, and to call you to impossible standards and the most utterly idealistic goals. Because I know you will be challenged to get there. You will stake your life on it. A bit of a counter, I guess, to my dear friends and colleagues at Kellogg's. I'm asking you to risk everything on everything but the market. I'm glad you know that you need to have people like me around who can tell you no. No, you can't. And like all good Chicagoans, can also tell you, yes, yes, you can. Thank you. Okay.
What a profound set of thoughts, and we'll have to ruminate on all of them. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts or reflections after hearing that, or anything you'd like to ask Lori. Greg.
Thanks, Lori, for a very interesting, as always, talk. What I wonder is, ethics certainly plays an important role, and causes us to reflect on what we should and shouldn't do. At the same time, especially in the area of that has to do with fertility, has to do with reproduction, as many of us know, there are moves by the legislators, by the courts, to get into that area, either to be more restrictive or more or less restrictive, however you want to define it. And so given these profound questions that you've raised, questions that oftentimes don't have a clear answer, even in philosophy, where do you see the role of the law coming in, and how, and how heavy of a hand should it have, especially at this early stage of Oncofertility project?
Thank you for my lawyer. I think the law plays a role in some sense to imagine a world in which people do the right thing. The law has this prophetic aspect to it. So I think lawyers should be spending time thinking about what's the best possible way to organize a society and what to do, what sorts of regulations are going to be needed. I think one example of what happens when no one takes steps is the guy with 150 siblings, children that he doesn't know. And these large groups of, I don't know what we're supposed to call them, families, groupings, herds of people. I don't know what we're supposed to call this name of thing. Because no one was paying any attention, or people were just taking in money, and they were just exchanging money but not exchanging a larger picture somewhere. So the law needs to step in if human relationships fail. Now, the ideal situation would have been, in every IVF clinic, for someone to be saying, let's have a discussion about the permissible number of children that can be created from any one sperm donor, and how that should be recorded, and the accountability and the transparency of that exchange as a social, theological moment, right, as opposed to an economic moment. They did it in Britain, they didn't do it in the US, right, and we can see how that unfolds. Another thing is obviously the use of abortion techniques to end the lives of girl fetuses that aren't wanted. Where are we going with that? And those sort of longer-term philosophic discourses, philosophers would rather they be wandering around like philosopher kings in a republic, right? But if that doesn't happen, then the law has got to be thinking of some outer limits and outer boundaries. Imagine your ideal world, Greg, and imagine what restrictions, regulations would be needed to get there. Who's going to enforce such a regulation? And that should form the outer boundaries of how we construct a society in the best case.
Okay.
I guess I have a question that would require a bit of expansion. We're faced often these days with opportunities because of the technologies that have advanced, and I'm thinking specifically of one case where you can, as an individual, undergo genetic counseling. And for many people, they're then faced with a very serious situation where they can be told that they have a mutation that may indeed just lead them to be susceptible for disease, or in fact something that would put them at a higher risk of certainty of developing that disorder. Both as patients, as clinicians, and researchers, how would you suggest that we apply these principles when you're faced with something where, I think one of the speakers gave an example of a sister that had a BRCA1 mutation and the other didn't. These are really serious situations, and how would you suggest that we deal with this, both on all three of these principles?
I'm a strong believer in telling the absolute truth. Certainly about, tell the truth about what you know, including the truth about your uncertainty, right? You should need to be able to explain what predisposition is from certainty, right? From a single allele point mutation to a predisposition, a higher risk, a higher ratio. But that's not a new problem, actually. Interestingly enough, if you study Talmudic literature, as I do, what I note is that, in fact, there is an understanding that certain marriages ought not happen, right? Because of a higher risk of disease, a higher disease burden. Now, they were a little off. They understood something about inheritability, but they didn't understand how exactly it worked, so they had broad ideas about the kind of people who should marry each other. and the kind of way it should work. So it's not like a new thing to think about. Perhaps we ought not have children. Perhaps we ought not, this isn't the best union. So that thinking about genetic counseling in the traditional narrative terms actually grounds it. So it's not so sort of odd or new or technique-y. It's actually an extension of how we thought through what was arranged marriages, essentially. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. It's not a new idea. It's a strong technique over an older idea about that there are good and bad people to marry based on characteristics that you want or don't want in your children, right? Or you may get married and not have children, or raise the children of others, or do something else. So it's not like you can find these discussions really throughout the religious text. That's one answer. The other answer is, I really believe that no information should be withheld, as I said, and that the world is broken and people might face sad choices and sad outcomes that medicine cannot fix, that there's real limits to what medicine can do to fix things. And there ought to be limits on how we manipulate the technology, the money, the world, other people's bodies to create answers, because some problems are just a tragedy that can't be addressed. Not all, but some, right? And so I think that's, genetic counselors come up against that and have to say hard and difficult things and need to learn to tell hard news frankly and forthrightly. So that's, you know, one sister has a disease, one sister has a predisposition, is a carrier for BRCA1 or BRCA2, the other isn't. That is because we are contingent, fragile creatures in a broken and unfair world. And there it is. And nothing that a genetic counselor can do can change that tragic reality. We forget that medicine is a tragic enterprise, that the world is broken at a huge cost. And to remember that and to live as a witness to that brokenness, frankly, is one of the most noblest work in medicine and nursing and genetic counseling. The capacity to say, it is not fair, and I am with you in that. I am with you in that. Is in some cases, for Hawass, all that you can do. Does that answer it?
Perhaps the dialogue could continue on Wednesday, when, Lori, you're hosting another discussion
right.
on this and other topics, and maybe we could invite our colleagues to that meeting.
So the questions I raised that I said are still outstanding questions, or a list of concerns that I really have that we don't have settled ideas about. They're the questions that emerged after the 5 years when we did settle on some things, but it opened up new possibilities, and new dramas are now before us, including this very interesting struggle about this notion of what children are to us. And when we change the relationships, do we make the world a better moral place or not? And I want to keep that question very open and alive for us as we proceed.